I found an old recording of the most gruesome TV show ever broadcast. Me and Lila always carved dozens of jack-o'-lanterns every October, so they'd absolutely saturate our lawn on Halloween night. It was our thing. But looking back, now that I've lost her, I just feel sorry for the pumpkins. I almost relate to them somehow. The way they were carved up had everything of substance inside of them torn out and left as hollow, rotting shells with forced smiles. Needless to say, I didn't handle her death well. I didn't want to face it. I wanted the world to drown in the black sludge of my grief. I loathed the people I saw going about their lives, unaware that the world had already ended the moment Lila died. The earth shouldn't keep spinning. Life shouldn't go on. Not without her. Even my relatives bringing me along on a trip to Kauai only made it worse. The most gorgeous place on earth, and it made me sick with hatred. Nothing that beautiful deserved to exist if Lila wasn't ever going to get to see it. It wasn't fair. I thought I'd never enjoy or care about anything again. Then I discovered media preservation. It started with taking some of Lila's old VHS tapes to a video repair place to fix some issues with the footage before it's digitized. The job fascinated me. In a universe based on entropy, where everything inevitably fades away and is forgotten, restoring something lost is like snatching it from the jaws of death, right? Like flipping the bird to the universe and its so-called natural order. People die, but information doesn't have to. Now, it doesn't matter how small, be it some god-awful plug-and-play licensed game or a cereal commercial from the 80s, it's my mission to recover it in as high a quality as I'm able and make sure it's freely available online for as long as possible. A couple weeks ago, I came across a big haul, 4 boxes of old VHS tapes offered on eBay for dirt cheap. Most of the tapes were just recordings of Cheers episodes already preserved in higher qualities, but one Maxell E240 caught my interest. First of all, I'd never seen one so melted. Sure, sometimes they were left in an attic too long, and the colors and audio start to degrade. But this one looked like it had survived a house fire. It was covered in soot and the smell of smoke, and had the overall shape of a chocolate bar left out in the sun a little too long. Second was the label, which read in neat Sharpie, Epiode 4679 329, Mar 8, 2035. The casing was so disfigured I had to bust it apart, just pull out the tapes and respool them in a fresh cassette. I tried to iron out the creases in the tape as best I could, but I had no illusions about it accomplishing much. The mylar surface had been irreparably warped in places by whatever fire had half melted the thing. Imagine my despair at the sight of that dreaded no ignal. I could clearly see the tape wasn't blank, yet no amount of adjusting the tracking or trying different TVs or VCRs accomplished anything. Just as I was about to give up, though, the thing just suddenly started playing properly at the exact instant the clock struck 3 a.m., as if it had only now decided to work. My all-nighter had paid off. I didn't dwell on the fact that this miracle fix had been impossible. If I'd had any sense, I'd have torn the horrid thing out of my VCR and buried it beneath holy ground. Instead, fool I was, I sat down and watched. At first, the thing seemed unwatchable. The audio was so distorted that the show's theme song emerged as a low, crackling, staticky wail that made my head throb, and the logo was completely indistinguishable through the flickering and interference. I thought it was a lost cause for a moment. But then, a figure appeared and cleared away the static, like Noah parting the Red Sea. It was the sight of the show's host that hooked me. He was just perfect, perfect in every way. I knew it just by watching him. Infinitely handsome and likable and charismatic, and he always said the exact perfect thing. The only issue is, I don't remember a single thing about him now, in the same way you can't remember a dream that seemed so clear to you while you were experiencing it. He just appears in my memory as this abstract blur in a sharp suit, yet at the time I was awestruck, even before he said a single word. I can't even remember a word he said. It was like he was speaking another language, one I felt as opposed to hearing. I'll try and transcribe it as best I can into words, but know that it's only a pathetic imitation. For another night of laughs, prizes, and fun for the whole family, with your host, Poozt. I noticed that the audio and visual distortion seemed to suddenly intensify the instant he said his name, rendering it completely illegible. Idiot I was. I figured that was a coincidence. Tonight is a night of celebration, folks, because thanks to the support of loyal viewers like you, we have just been approved for, get this, 200,000 more seasons. The live studio audience went wild with applause. I put that in scare quotes because, as far as I could tell, besides the host, the studio seemed completely empty, as if he was standing on a plain white stage that extended outwards into infinite darkness on all sides. For those just joining us, the game here is simple. He explained that it was like a trivia show. Every time a guest got an answer wrong, it brought them a little closer to some sort of unspecified punishment. And if they got it right, he smirked, well, they get to delay the inevitable. I wondered what he meant by inevitable. I didn't have to wonder for long. The host gestured to a curtain that hadn't been there moments ago, which raised to reveal a middle-aged man. You know the type? Bushy mustache, grey hair, round-rimmed glasses. Kind of guy you'd have doing your plumbing. He couldn't look any more out of place, stood up and restrained in that. What the hell is that? I recognized that metal coffin-looking thing from a medieval torture museum I went to once. The Iron Maiden, the lid hung open, countless long needle-like blades poking inwards, threatening to poke a million new holes in him if it was shut. His situation was not lost on him. Where am I? What the hell is this? Oh, lucky guess, the host joked, more canned laughter. I know you always loved watching those trivia shows, Malcolm. Weren't you always sitting there, grinding your teeth, seething that it wasn't fair, that you should be the one up on stage, winning big? The man paused. Even he seemed mesmerized by the unreal perfection of the host before him. This is a game show? All you have to do is answer a few questions. Think you can handle that, Malcolm? He pulled out a cue card without waiting for an answer. And our first question, what were you doing the night of February 18th, 1998? The man seemed baffled. Just sat on my couch watching the NFL, I think. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to remember. He let out a startled squeal as a horrid buzzer sounded. On cue, the lid slid a third of the way closed, making him flinch. Ooh, I'm afraid that's the wrong answer, Frank. But you know what? I'll give you another chance. What were you? Following a girl home, the man cried out. From the bar. Are you happy? Correct, the canned audience began cheering. Such honesty. Now, our second question. Just what were you carrying while you followed her? He hesitated a little too long, and then the buzzer sounded again, and the lid slid so near to closing that its blades began poking uncomfortably against his skin. He tried to press himself against the back of the maiden, and his restraints would allow. Jesus, okay, a knife. Oh, if only you'd said that just a second earlier. Another big question. Our third question, why, Malcolm? Why did you do it? That set Malcolm off. He started thrashing, clawing, and screaming. Let me out of this thing, you maniac. You can't do this to me. Do you know who I am? Is this some sick joke? My lawyers will have your head for this, you... And then the buzzer. All of a sudden, the lid slammed shut full force, and the man was utterly silenced, save for an unnatural, drawn-out wheeze. Another wrong answer, Malcolm. I'm afraid I was looking for, because if I can't have her, no one can. I admit it. I laughed, out of shock more than anything. How was this allowed on TV? I took it as some sort of dark comedy show, and it was kind of satisfying to see that freaky character get his comeuppance. Still, there was something unnerving to me, seeing the man's eyes through the openings in the maiden. Wide and red and terrified. They just looked a little too real. But the maiden disappeared as quickly as it came before I could dwell on it too much. Oh, envy. Definitely one of my favorite sins. More laughter. Stay tuned, folks. We've still got a night of fun and games in store for you. But first, how's about a word from our sponsors? Cut to a corporate logo, which I again couldn't recognize. This segment was made possible by Buer Health, which has recently announced a brilliant new initiative to protect our citizens from skin cancer by removing their skin completely. The camera cut to a massive industrial building, resembling a solid concrete cube around 50 meters in width and height. Its surface bore arcane symbols etched using carvings of wailing, tormented faces. The host would occasionally be rendered inaudible by a deafening metallic scraping from within, though he didn't seem to notice. The only protrusion from the building's cubic shape was a single smokestack, belching a scarlet red smoke into the atmosphere. A queue of gaunt figures waited at the entrance, herded and coerced by their grim overseers, and there were no words to describe the procession of scarlet ghouls limping out the building's other end. Owing to the non-linearity of time, the brand new grand skin peeling machine has spontaneously appeared several years before construction deadlines, and indeed, before it was even conceived of by anyone in our timeline. People have rushed all the way from Melbolge just to try this miracle of technology out on opening day, and so far, the reviews have been stellar. He shoved his microphone in the face of a shambling thing that could only scarcely be called a human. Tatters of flesh clung to its exposed musculature, blowing in the wind. Its eyes were the only hint of color in that sea of bloody red, and they were wide, white, and terrified. The thing screamed and wailed for as long as it could before the last tendons connecting its jaw to its face snapped, and it was left to choke and gurgle. An amazing wail. The results speak for themselves, folks. The grand skin peeling machine is a hit. So far, I was still laughing along and having a good time. The sight of the next guest, however, started making me nervous. It was an old lady. She couldn't be a day younger than 60, the sort of sweet elderly woman who in a just world would be cooking chocolate chip cookies for her grandchildren in a comfy cottage somewhere. But here she was, tied to a metal chair, eyes wide, shaking like a leaf. Unlike the last contestant, she seemed to know exactly what was happening. In exchange for our loving endorsement, they've agreed to loan us one of their star employees. Ladies and gentlemen, join hands. Lekizma. Something slunk from the darkness far behind her. Or perhaps it'd be more apt to say that the darkness birthed it whole cloth. It was like a living shadow, and it took my eyes a moment to register what I was even seeing. How do I even begin describing this creature? I could say it looked almost human, or at least like something that may have been human long ago. Or I could start with its skin, which was all black and shiny as latex, and seemingly smooth on first glance, but if you looked closer, you'd realize it was covered in a million tiny reptilian scales, almost like a shark. Its head was a bald man's, utterly devoid of any distinguishing features, like the basic stock template for a human being. It was notable only for a complete lack of pupils and irises, its eyes a pure white. Its body defied basic biology in so many key ways. I had to stare it at for what felt like an eternity, just to wrap my mind around its physiology. It was at least 5 or 6 meters long, by my estimate, composed of multiple human torsos, stacked one on top of the other, like segments of a centipede, each melding with the ones around it at the waist and shoulders. Each torso sported a pair of short, stubby arms that propelled it with terrifying grace. It ended with a pair of human legs perpetually bent on their knees, beneath a tail that looked more like its coccyx was poking free from its body. The old last could clearly hear it, and kept futilely trying to turn her head around enough to get a peek at what stood behind her. I mouthed uselessly, "Don't. You don't want to know." "Glad you could join us again, Miss Weathersby. Judging by our ratings last week, you seem to have been a fan favorite." Her voice was so soft, I could barely hear it below the static. "Oh God, please, why won't you people let me go? I've told you I've never done anything, never hurt anybody. There must be some sort of..." He waved a hand over her, and it seemed to forcefully snap her mouth shut. "Please, Miss Weathersby, save your breath for our questions." Another cue card. "Your first question, my friend. Where did you and your husband buy your first home?" She had to think about it for a long time. Eventually, she cried out, "Alabama! Tuscaloosa, Alabama!" Ding, ding, ding. Why, you're already doing better than our first contestant. Next question. What breed of dog was your childhood pet? She had a pained look on her face as she thought. Eventually, a timer started ticking down. It wasn't visible, so it wasn't clear how much time she had left exactly, but the sound it made got more shrill and high-pitched with every second. "Miss Weathersby, need I remind you that we have a time limit on this show?" A tear ran down her cheek. I keep telling you people, I don't know. I have dementia. I can't remember, please." That buzzer again. I'm afraid that was the wrong answer. Lekizma? The old lady shuddered at the sounds of hundreds of feet drawing a little closer to her. "Now, your first grandchild. What did he look like? What color were his eyes? His hair?" She was crying harder now, like it hurt her that she couldn't remember something so dear to her. "I told you I can't remember. Why are you doing this to me?" If you don't remember them, why would they remember you? The host mocked as the buzzer sounded, and the beast drew a little closer. Really, do you believe they still even think about you? Or do you think they're glad that the old bag of bones isn't there sucking up their inheritance? This went on for, God, it could have been an hour. I was glued to the screen all the while, frozen with terror, praying for this nightmare to just end, for her to make it out okay somehow. He pored over every little detail of the life she lived and the people she loved, delighting in how little of it she could still recall. And the thing grew closer and closer until she finally felt multiple pairs of hands resting upon her shoulders. The thing was looming over her now. A long black tongue a few feet in length emerged from its mouth and ran trails of dark saliva over the back of her head. She looked broken down, eyes raw from crying, and I could tell by the dampness of her dress that she'd wet herself. Now, Miss Weathersby, our time here has been fun, but I do believe it is time for our final question. Tell me, what is the name of your only son? She couldn't even answer anymore. She just stared ahead, like her mind was a million miles away. He cackled as the buzzer sounded one final time and threw his cue cards aside. Thank you for playing, Miss Weathersby. Better luck next time. I would say the thing unhinged its jaw like a snake, but that'd be an understatement. The way the thing's face malformed and wrinkled and stretched as it opened its maw, it no longer looked even remotely human. Its jaws must have parted at least 30 centimeters apart, revealing a second, pharyngeal pair of jaws that lashed out and gripped the woman's skull, pulling her headlong into that darkness. I could hear bones crunching and snapping as its throat constricted down around her body, peristaltic muscles compacting her into a meat slurry bit by bit. Yet she just wouldn't die. Even as her skull and upper body were already crushed and compacted, organs and muscles pressed into mulch, she still kicked her legs, twitched her fingers, let out a gurgling that must have been some attempt at screaming. She was squirming even as the beast snapped its jaw shut around the last of her, condemning her to whatever torments awaited her inside the creature. And all the while, that horrible laughter. Don't worry, folks, she'll be back next week and the next and the next. Needless to say, I wasn't having fun anymore. In fact, I had to turn away and fight the urge to throw up. I stood, about to turn the TV off and... Don't touch that dial now. I froze. There was something chilling about the way he said that, staring right into the screen as if reacting to what I was doing. I hated that grin on his face. The real show is just beginning. And with the barely restrained excitement of a child on Christmas morning, he yanked back another curtain and I recognized everything. I recognized that crappy bootleg knockoff, Always Sunny, in Philadelphia, jacket that was so gaudy and terrible, it instantly became her favorite thing in her wardrobe. I recognized those subtle hints of slight acne she disguised as fake freckles. I recognized the way her grey eyes would remind me of those overcast mornings at the beach at Hilton Head, and pointing out all the cannonball jellyfish washed up on the sands. I recognized that tattoo of the name Rocky, how I'd held her all night long as she cried into my shirt after her childhood cat had died. It was Lila. I shuddered, gasped, fell from my seat as if I'd been punched in the stomach and the air had been knocked out of me. I couldn't breathe. This couldn't be real. I was dreaming right now. I must be. I just had to wake up. But I couldn't wake up. Nothing I could do dispelled the sight of her curled up in that thing. That bronze statue of a bull, horns jutting on either side of a head that roared silently up at the heavens, all while the love of my life was locked in its hollowed-out belly, visible only through a pane of glass. I could hear her cry out in shock at where she'd found herself, and every whimper felt like it drove a knife through my chest. The host soaked in the moment. It was ecstasy for him, the suffering of it all. He stared dead into the camera like he was looking right at me as she called, "What is this? Where am I?" "Why, I have good news, my dear Lila. You're exactly where every American dreams of being. You're on TV." He pointed to the camera. "And we have a very special guest in the audience tonight. Your very own beloved Jackson." I shuddered, hearing my own name ooze from his fetid lips. His facade of perfection was slipping, and there was something so profoundly ugly beneath it. Her eyes snapped to the camera, confused, despairing. "Jackson, baby, what's happening? What is this?" I don't know, I thought, gripping the sides of the TV so hard my knuckles turned white, but I'm going to get you out of there, baby. I'm going to find whoever did this, and I'm going to bury them all so far beneath that studio that they'll never... I'm afraid Jackson hasn't joined us quite yet, my dear, but if you truly love him, surely you'll give him a show to remember, won't you? He taunted her. All I want, after all, is to ask you a few questions. In fact, I'll offer you a special deal. Get even a single answer right, and I'll let you go free. But get one wrong, and well... On cue, a fire was lit beneath her, small, smouldering for now, but she whimpered as she noticed the heat. We both realized in that instant what this was. By now, I was screaming things I can't repeat here, and slamming my hands against the TV screen as if I could reach through and save her. She bit her lip and acquiesced, not like she had any room to argue. The host grinned and readied a cue card. Your first question. Where are you, Lila? I don't know. How am I supposed to know? You do know, Lila. You know exactly where you are. He smirked at her. Here's a free hint. What's the last thing you remember before you woke up here? She thought about it and choked back a sob, visibly shaking as the realization slowly settled in. But why? The horrible wail of the buzzer cut her off. Ooh, too bad. I'm afraid you've run out of time. Seemingly as if on its own, the fire doubled in size. Sparks licked the belly of the bronze bull and began to ever so slowly heat the surface. She poured around in the tight confines, searching for any reprieve from the scalding heat all around her, as the metal grew hot, like it had been left out in the sun on a summer's day. Please, oh God, let me out of this thing. It hurts, it hurts. The host seemed to breathe in her pain as if stealing a moment's indulgence. Now that there is no doubt about where you are, my dear, let us proceed to the second question. He switched to his next card. Did you believe in God in the end? Oh, of course. She pleaded her case as if she was being tried in court. My entire life, every day I gave to the poor, helped the sick, did whatever I could to honor high... I'm afraid you misunderstood my question. I asked, did you believe in him in the end? The very moment your pitiful little life was snuffed out? I always believed I'd never forsake him. Yes, I know. You lived a good and holy life, didn't you? He cackled. But at the end, you and your little husband were so excited to deliver your first little baby boy. But oh, tragedy. It all went wrong, didn't it? Your precious little boy didn't make it through childbirth, and you followed closely behind. That whole business with the botched pregnancy, it was, what do you call it? Ah, yes, a test of faith. And I'm afraid you failed. In your final moments, you watched the light fade from your child's eyes, and you assumed, wisely in my humble opinion, that no kind and loving God would allow something like that to happen. He laughed. Funny how, after a lifetime of dutiful service, all it takes is one little mistake at the end, to bring you here, to us. I'd never seen such depths of despair in a person's eyes, such emptiness, like with every word, he'd been scooping out another piece of her until she was hollow. And then that buzzer roared again, more shrill than ever, and I could barely see her little window through the smoke and flames. The belly of the bull was turning orange in places, and I could hear her flesh start to sizzle like meat on a grill. There are no words for the noises she made, no words at all. And our last final question, he continued, what were your last words to your poor beloved Jackson? I love you, I called out the response. Bloody fingerprints stained the TV screen from slamming my hands against it as I screamed the answer over and over. I love you, I love you, I love you. At some point I forgot there was a question. I was just shouting it at her, as if hoping that she could hear it, that it could bring her a modicum of comfort in that place. The buzzer sounded again. I couldn't bring myself to look. All I could hear was the roaring of the bull and the steam rising from its bronze nostrils. The curtain fell. Silence drowned the sound. The host dropped all pretense that he hadn't been speaking directly to me. Now, Jackson, you just might be one of my new favorite audience members this show has ever had. I know this must have been hard for you, but if you'll just stay tuned, I have one more show I know you're certain to love. I didn't bother to touch the remote. After all, nothing could be worse than what I'd just seen, right? Wrong. Horror racked me as the curtain rose and I saw the man chained to a chair. I pulled away like a caveman witnessing fire, cringing and stuttering, face wet with sweat. It was the sort of fear that worked its way into your bones like a bad chill that left you shaking, teeth chattering. It was me, an older me, sure, but not by much, 10 years maybe, a gaunt and hollow version of me, one twisted by 10 years of depression and hard drugs. But it was unmistakable. His eyes widened as he recognized the host. Oh, God. God, please, no. It can't be. Oh, Christ, let me out of this chair, you... Come now. We wouldn't want to use the Lord's name in vain, would we? I mean, that would be a sin. The host laid a hand on the other man's shoulder. It may have been a few years since you watched our program, but I'm sure you remember the rules, don't you, old friend? The other me was wordless, on the verge of hyperventilating, just as I was. The host was giddy with delight. Now, our first and only question is one I'm sure our viewer will be very interested in. What sins exactly do you think landed you here? The other me tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. I could see it in his eyes. The years of self-destruction, the bitter hopelessness, the whirlpool of nihilism and vice and decay, the suffocating depths of a man, the darkness, how could he put it into words? The sound of the buzzer was like a pig's squeal. I'm afraid that our viewer is going to have to figure that out for himself. In the meantime, your punishment, well, we wouldn't want to spoil anything. The curtains slowly began to fall, just as a couple other of those black, grotesque monstrosities emerged from the darkness. The curtain covered them all before I could get a good look at their obscene, twisted, asymmetrical figures. All I could hear was the crunching, the sound of skin tearing like paper, the screaming that went on for longer and louder than a human throat or vocal cords could endure. The image and audio were beginning to distort, glitch, burn away. The tapes were physically melting as they played. My VCR was starting to overheat, sparks pouring from its front panel. The host voice jumped around in tone, his voice fading into the static blur as the tapes bubbled and boiled and distorted. But my friends, I'm afraid that tonight's episode of our show will end. So, with a final farewell to our dear beloved viewer, Jackson. Just before the image melted away, the camera seemed to jump forward until his face filled the screen, his eyes piercing into mine as he cackled in that sing-song voice. See you soon! I really wish that this were not a true story, but I had the unfortunate luck of living out my very own urban legend. Before that night a few years ago, I really used to believe that houses were where frightening things happened. With all those unseen rooms and corridors, basements and attics, surely an apartment is always safe. At the time, I was living in a unit on the 16th story of a building in downtown Toronto. As a horror movie freak, I rationalized all the strange creaks and rattles I heard through the ceiling and the walls as my noisy neighbors or the plumbing, and slept soundly every night. One night my boyfriend was away on business and I stayed up late watching TV. I grew drowsy around 2 a.m. and made my way to bed, turning off the lights as I went. At some point during the night I woke up. I don't know exactly what time it was, but I couldn't have been sleeping for more than an hour. At first I wasn't sure what it was that woke me, but then I heard it again. A knocking on the front door. Still drowsy and a bit fearful as I was alone, I stayed in bed and waited. There it was again, a knock, knock, knock. My bedroom was at the furthest end of the apartment, as far from the front door as could be, but there was no mistaking that there was someone there. Awake now, my first thought was that I should go see who it was, but something, my instincts, kept me in bed and silent. The knocking came again, more frantic now. I said to myself that I was being cowardly, that it could be a neighbor who needed help. But as I had these thoughts, the frantic knocking turned into an almighty pounding. That's when I gave up entertaining the idea of going to the door. Whoever was out there could try calling on someone else. I was alone and female, and way too worked up to be of much assistance to anyone. I stayed still and silent, and prayed that my visitor would give up and leave. The pounding continued for what seemed like hours, but what was probably only a few minutes. Intermittently, the sound changed back to the polite tapping, and then again picked up in fervor, to the point where I truly believed that whatever was out there was going to try and break in. I wanted to grab my phone and call someone, but who? The police? I was sure at this point that what was happening in my hallway was a very determined person, hell-bent on getting what they needed from me. But in the blackness of night, I didn't feel like I had a solid grasp on my wits. I wasn't even positive that what was happening was real. It was so terrifyingly strange. I was afraid that any noise I made would confirm to the freak that someone was home, and I was not willing to take the risk. All I could do was lie as still as I could in my dark bedroom, crying silently and praying. Why were my neighbors not coming to see what the commotion was about? Why was no one helping me? Why was this happening? What did it want? Knocking, 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 pounding. Why, go away? My God, knocking, knock, knock, knock. Then it stopped. I lay there shaking, every sense, straining. Nothing. It was gone. Oh my God, it has given up. It has left, thanks. A scraping. Outside the front door, there was a sharp scratching sound like someone was taking their fingernails across the wood. Over and over. I'm not sure I fainted, but suddenly it was morning. The sounds had ceased. Everything looked different, bathed in light. The noises seemed so bizarre, so far away, that I couldn't feel sure that anything had happened at all. And I roused myself from my bed, feeling braver than the night before. I tiptoed into my hallway and started towards the front door, feeling my heart pounding heavily the closer I drew. As I reached the front of my apartment, there was a sharp rap on the door. I must have yelped or screamed because someone called out to me, "It's okay, it's the police. Open up." The police? Jesus. I looked through the peephole to be sure and undid the lock. On opening the door, I was faced with a somber-looking officer. Past him, into the hallway, I could see more cops milling around. The policeman explained that someone had snuck into my building during the night. Security cam footage showed them prowling around random floors, knocking on doors and walking away. As the officer spoke, I noticed most of the policemen were walking in and out of my next-door neighbor's unit, accompanied by paramedics. Around 4 a.m. that morning, my neighbor had been killed. A boy, a little younger than me, had evidently opened his door and a stranger had forced his way in. Someone a couple floors up eventually called the police an hour or so later after receiving some threatening knocks on their own door. I heard that the maniac was arrested in the hall of another floor, carrying a hunting knife, duct tape, and a Ziploc bag filled with the boy's tongue, eyes, and ears. Apparently the killer was a schizophrenic who tried to eat the contents of the bag as the police closed in on him. I was hyperventilating as the officer related the facts and managed to stutter that the knocking had been at my door as well. The cop nodded and asked me to step into the hall as they needed to examine my front door. It was then that I turned and saw that letters had been carved into my door, spelling the words "First Choice." I work in a speech clinic in a small northeastern city. Most of our clientele are older people who travel into the city with assistance from a middle-aged son or daughter. However, there is a fair amount of children who come through for speech therapy appointments. Since it is a college town, we often have undergrad or graduate assistants helping out in the assessments and filing. It's a nice, chilled-out place to be, and the staff members are very kind and helpful. It's been my dream job until it started turning strange. A few years ago, I started working with an 87-year-old man who finally decided he needed hearing aids. Well, it was less of his decision and a lot more of his wife tricking him into thinking they were going out for lunch. After a tremendous amount of pouting and a very unsatisfactory hearing test, he finally conceded that he was having some issues and could need a little assistance. He and his wife were at their core very normal people for their age. There was very little flash or surprise to them. Just good old-fashioned country people living in the modern world. So, as many people do, he returned about a year later with a broken hearing aid. Apparently he had dropped it into the sink and didn't realize it was out until the garbage disposal was turned on. After playfully remarking that he probably did it on purpose, I gave him a pair of loaners. For those of you who aren't familiar, these are just a test pair of hearing aids that we offer out to customers who have lost or broken them. That way, they can still have something to use while their new ones are ordered and shipped in. It's pretty standard procedure. A few days after I gave them to him, I was reading through the newspaper and found his name pop up in the obituaries. He died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. I immediately picked up the phone and sent my condolences. There was nothing on the other line, and it seemed it had been disconnected. I never ended up getting a call back or invitation to the service, but I didn't have another thought about it. I really didn't know him that well. It was sad, but there was nothing more I could do. I cancelled his order of hearing aids and went back to my business. Then a few months ago, I started treating this 5-year-old boy. He is incredibly hard of hearing and needs a tremendous boost to hear higher frequency sounds. Since he is so young, his speech is very slushy and often full of misplaced S's and Z's. Still, he's just a normal child with a hearing loss. He likes to play with toy trucks and watch cartoons. He thinks it's funny to throw the cat into the bathtub and toss rocks at birds. He really is a great kid. He came in about a week ago to place an order for new hearing aids and take out our loaners. Apparently, he had seen his mother clean them with the special tools and thought it would be helpful to put them in the dishwasher to clean. It destroyed them. For some strange reason, a lot of the newer model loaners had been taken out, and we had to give him one of the older processors. It was a shame because the functionality was a little different and the sound had a greater tinny quality. However, there was nothing that happened in that visit that day that would or should have prompted the rest of this story. I get a call a day later from his mother, who is on the verge of being frantic. She says her son did not sleep the night before and stayed up in his room talking to his imaginary friend. I guess this is something that is completely new for him. At first, she thought it was just one of those cute phases that kids go through and that it was just an overactive imagination. But that morning, as she was making breakfast, he told her that he knew about Mr. Jackson. She confided that he was a man who she had been having an affair with for a brief stint. She also confirmed that no one had known or should have known. When she asked him about it, the boy just said the man in his ear told him. Her eyes went wide with creepy suspicion, and she called me on the off chance that I had any knowledge of ESP being an added cause of hearing aids. I couldn't confirm her silly suspicions, and tossed my hands up in bewilderment. It was certainly a strange call. However, it would only get weirder. His behavior continued to get stranger as he would continue to tell her secrets and odd facts he had no way of knowing. He told his father verbatim the last words that his father had told him before he passed, and terrified his sister by claiming that their new puppy was going to drown in the pool. The mom had to spend a full hour showing the young girl that the dog could do the doggy paddle just to get her to stop crying. Still, it got worse. He began referencing the voice as Billy and stated that he was a little boy just like him. When questioned further, he said he could never see Billy but just hear him. Fear itched it way across her body as she listened to him tell her things that Billy told her. How the earth would stop spinning one day and we would all fall into the sun. How serial killers lived in their neighborhood and would kill them at night. Finally, she got so tired of it, she pulled the hearing aids out of his ears and locked them away. She wanted to see if it was something that was going on in his head or if it was something that he was hearing. The only two viable options to her were that her son was losing his mind or that he was hearing some strange ghost that was in the home. But neither made sense to her. Until then, he had been a normally developing child, and no one had ever died in that house, at least to her knowledge. It had been built in the early 80s and had only been occupied by one family before them, and they were both middle-aged without any small boys. In fact, they had 3 daughters. It was all very strange. This information she relayed to me one quiet afternoon when all of it had gotten to be too much for her. On a last-ditch effort, she considered that it might have been the hearing aids, since they were the only changing factor. I seriously doubted that was the case, but went back through the records to see how the last people to sign them out had been, and sure enough, it was the old man who had killed himself with the shotgun. I rang her up real fast and invited her to come to my office and pore over the records with me. I also called his widow, and to my surprise, she answered the phone. After a brief conversation, she noted that there was indeed a difference in his husband's temperament right before his suicide. In fact, she said, it all seemed to have begun when he put those hearing aids in. An hour later, the 3 of us sat in my office, listening to each other's stories and trying to figure out what the common tie was. The widow stated that her husband had started hearing voices. He would look around while in the house as though he could hear a distant person talking. Then, after a while, I would catch him responding. I would walk into a room and he'd be mid-sentence with thin air. It was the spookiest thing I'd ever seen. I swear to God, that's probably what did him in. I don't know how or why. And in that particular moment, an odd chill went through the mother's body. There was no conceivable reason to worry. The boy was safe at home with a babysitter, and his hearing aids were in a jar far too high for him to get to. But still, the thought lingered in her brain, and she quickly exited the office, stricken with fear. And this phenomenon was nothing more than mother's intuition. When she returned home, the front door was wide open. The babysitter lay unconscious with blood streaming lazily from a cut on her head. The clay pot the hearing aids were in lay smashed and scattered in her hair. She followed a trail of muddy footprints through the hallway and the kitchen out to the backyard. The new puppy drifted peacefully on the surface of the pool, limply staying afloat. A light purple emanated from around it, tendrils slowly reaching out and infecting the pure chlorinated blue water. And on the flagstones near the deep end, her son stood smiling, coated in the fresh dark blood of his kill. His hearing aids turned on. Thank you for dropping by the archives and listening to our ghastly stories. Don't forget to like, comment, and lastly subscribe. Until next time, archivists, I bid you all good night.